Okay. Hello, everyone. Oh, this is a little loud. I'd like to thank you all for joining us here today for a conversation about a topic that has gained much attention recently, the role of social media in terrorist incitement. I'd also like to extend a warm thank you to all our sponsors here tonight, Alliance for Israel, the Brandeis Center, Harvard Hillel, and Shurat Hadin, for making this panel discussion possible. My name is Aviv Lazar, and I'm a 2L here at Harvard Law School, and I will be moderating the event this evening. Over this past summer, after my 1L year, I interned at an NGO called Shurat Hadin, and in light of my work there, I decided it would be beneficial to bring this discussion to the Harvard Law School community. So before introducing all the panelists, I just want to give a quick overview of how the panel will proceed tonight. We would start by allowing each panelist to speak a little bit about him or herself, background, point of view, thoughts, etc., for about 10 minutes each. And then after that, I'll ask the panel some more directed questions to which any panelist is welcome to answer. And then at the conclusion of the main panel event, we'll open up the floor to the audience for Q&A. I'm excited to see you all here, and so let's get started. We'll start with Captin Nativ, who will give us a bit of background about how this social media is being used by terrorist organizations. Captin Nativ is the chief intelligence of, Captain Nativ is the chief of an intelligence section in the IDF's Central Command, where his primary focus is identifying and neutralizing daily terror threats from Judea and Samaria. Captain Nativ was first recruited to the Israeli Defense Forces Intelligence Directorate in 2009 as a cadet in the Elite Military Intelligence Offers Training Program. Upon completing that program, he served for a number of years as a professional analyst in the RAD division. And so, Captain Nativ, go ahead, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, really excited to be here, so thank you all. Before I start, I want to show you a short video that will explain, I think in a graphic way, what we're dealing with in Israel. Well, for almost a year, I think more than a year, we're facing in Israel what we call the knife intifada, or, well, you can discuss if it's lone wolf or not, intifada. For more than a year already, you can see videos like this on Facebook, YouTube, or other platforms that are that call Palestinians from West Bank to stab and murder Israelis. This is a video that was made, I think, in Gaza and was spread out by YouTube and Facebook channels that explains people in the West Bank, Palestinians, how to get a knife and just go out and stab Israelis. So when we speak of social media and terror or incitement, what we'll discuss just in a few minutes, I think this is a really good video to see what we're talking about. This is one more video, also from Gaza. Here you can see, here you can see someone from a mosque in Gaza who's calling his brothers in the West Bank to go and stab Jewish people and Israelis.
I think it's worth pointing out that this is something that once would have been heard by maybe 100 people in the mosque, but with the use of social media, it's seen millions of times. Children sitting at home watching it over and over again, spreading it on Twitter and Facebook.
Exactly, yeah.
لماذا يا أمريكا أيها الصليبيين المعتدين يا صهاينة العرب أيها الصهاينة من اليهود المجرمين جئتم بخياركم أنتم للذبح في بلادنا كتفوا ناس تطعن بالبلط والسواطير اهجموا جماعات قطعوا الأشلاء.
Okay, so as I said, for more than a year we face in Israel what we call that knife intifada, where Palestinians are just going and getting the knives from the houses or getting whatever they have, taking their cars and trying to make vehicle attacks and just go and attack Jewish people, Israelis in the West Bank and Jerusalem. It's happened for more than a year now. We had a 3-month break actually, and since I got here to the States on Friday, we started this intifada again, and we already had, since Friday, more than 9 attacks where Palestinians from Judea and Samaria went and stabbed the Israelis. But if we talk about social media, I'll just start with my talk then. Well, terror organizations understood the potential in social media. They use Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. They've always used those platforms for their PR purposes and for psychological warfare. But in the last wave of terror that we're facing in Israel, we've seen an increased use in social media for incitement purposes. The main tool that they use is spreading well-made viral videos that touches national and nationalistic feelings, that speaks to the youth and contains exaggerated lies. So in that case, what they do is they lie in order to encourage violence and to kill Israelis. Those videos are being spread not only by official Hamas Facebook pages or YouTube channels, but also by agents, by proxies. They are using unofficial channels that are well known within their public and thus trying to avoid bans or the removal of those pages. Those are in fact moderators between the terror groups to the public, those pages. The youth today consumes those pages because they're looking for visuals, short videos that contains footage and even snuff from attacks that happened. If they watch a well-made video or a picture, they will share it. After a while, when their required content got viral enough, those pages will usually take those videos off. A good example for that will be Shihab News Agency. This news agency is affiliated with Hamas and played an inseparable role in fanning the flames and inciting among Palestinians in the last year and so. They are encouraging terrorism and vehicular attacks and spreading severe anti-Semitic propaganda with calls to murder Israelis. Facebook actually removed that page on February 15 after Israeli students who are a part of the program to fight anti-Semitism reported that page. Then the page had only 2.5 million likes, and today, this morning, I checked it, it has more than 6.3 million. So they removed it, it got back online, and now they have like 6.3 million likes. On June 8, a few months ago, around 9:20 p.m., well, I didn't tell you, but I live in Tel Aviv. I've heard shootings outside of my apartment in Tel Aviv. A few minutes after that, I've realized that there has been a terror attack in a restaurant just next to where I live, and that one of the 2 Palestinian terrorists who were suited up as businessmen ran inside my building to hide from the security forces. In that attack, 4 people had died, 16 were injured. After less than 24 hours, this video got viral. Wait. Sorry. Sorry, wait. I'll manage to do that. Okay. So have a look here. Remember that says Intifada al-Quds, Jerusalem's Intifada. And Well, you can see here a video that tries to encourage young people, young Palestinians from the West Bank during the holy month of Ramadan. This is just in the end of the day when they have the meal in the end of the fast. They call them to take action and kill Israelis. Here you can see a Palestinian who is suiting up. Well, in the beginning, when the terror attack just happened, we thought that those terrorists suited up as Orthodox Jews, and later on we understood that they were suited up as businessmen. So here you can see that only in the beginning, when we didn't know really what happened, already Hamas made that video. So here you can see a really well-made video who got really viral. It was made, I don't know, with all the right things to show to those Palestinians. It was spread out by Shihab, the news agency that I just told you about, and in a few hours it got to more than 200,000 people. It achieved its role in fanning the flames, got down from the internet, and moved on. I have more examples to show. That's okay. That's my name. Okay, so I will show you just one last example. As I told you, since Friday, we had a new wave in this wave of terror that we have. So that was on Friday, and what happened is that the Muslim world is now having, or just had, Eid al-Adha, one of their holidays, and well, sorry again, and this terror attack just happened in the end of Eid al-Adha. What you will see here, again, Intifada al-Quds down here. Yeah, you don't really have to hear that. So what you see here is 4 Palestinians who went and stabbed Jewish people in the West Bank, Israelis, and what Hamas did is call those people, here it says Eid al-Adha 4 days, al-Quds 4 shaheeds. There were 4 Palestinians who got killed by Israeli forces when they tried to murder other Israelis. So here you have 4 shaheeds, as they say. And now they're calling people to continue the Intifada. It says the Intifada Mustamra. That means that the Intifada continues. We had a break in the Intifada, but now with social media and Facebook and YouTube, Hamas tries to call people to go and make the Intifada go on again. Just something else that our organizations are doing with Facebook and social media is also trying to recruit people to their organizations, and also to guide them how to act and have more terror attacks. For example, I will give you Hezbollah's 133 unit that recruited Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank and also tried to recruit Israelis. They did that by contacting them on Facebook chats, in the beginning undercover, but later on identifying themselves as really as Hezbollah and guiding them what to do in order to kill Israelis, how to get their weapons, and where to go in order to do that. Of course, not to mention the use of Hezbollah and other terror groups in trying to collect information on the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, and to contact soldiers. I think one last thing I'll say is that social media enables not only the distribution of institutional and well-made incitement products, it's also a platform that rises copycats that copy their ideas from other terror attacks who got viral. We saw that more than 20% of the terrorists in the last wave of terror in Israel were from those kinds of people, lone wolves, who copycat their ideas from others. They saw videos on the internet, they saw incidents on the internet, they saw all kinds of terror attacks, and that encouraged them to go and do the same. You can just think of someone who wakes up in the morning, sees on the internet all kinds of those terror attacks, and see these incitement products, and just decides one day to go and also try to do that himself. That's something that we have to deal with daily in Israel. We have plenty of examples, but I think I will leave it for the Q&As. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Nativ. Now that some background on social media and terror has been presented, I'd like to introduce Michael Smith II, the COO of Kronos Advisory, who will narrow in a little bit more on the tracking and analysis of social media content. a terrorism analyst who specializes in the influence operations of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Mr. Smith has served as a contributing expert to the Congressional Anti-Terrorism Caucus and Congressional Task Force on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare. Since 2014, Michael has been involved with a variety of high-profile efforts focused on tracking the Islamic State's online recruitment and incitement programs, including collaboration with activist groups that infiltrate the Islamic State's social media networks and cyber infrastructure to identify recruitment programs and attack plots. So, Michael, take it away.
Hi. Can I see a show of hands, people who pay attention to news reports on terrorism? Okay. So maybe you've seen a little bit of reporting in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that's covered some of my work, which I'll discuss briefly. But even the aspect of the Islamic State's conversion of American social media companies' platforms into recruitment coup incitement tools, that's something that they're using to boost their profile in the eyes of would-be recruits in ways that news reporting on their attacks accomplishes for them as well. In June 2014, an unprecedented competition for dominance within the global jihad movement erupted when the former Iraq branch of Al-Qaeda rebranded itself the Islamic State and concomitantly declared it had established a caliphate while demanding that all other groups striving to achieve that goal should disband with their members pledging allegiance to al-Baghdadi. On social media at the time, on Twitter in particular, you could find official al-Qaeda accounts, such as the one used to push out content for As-Sahab, which puts together all of the messages from senior al-Qaeda leaders. Those accounts typically had a range of 20 to 30,000 followers. And the shelf life for those accounts sometimes was anywhere from 6 to 12 months before they would be taken down. So immediately Twitter became a key space in the cyber domain where the Islamic State was going to orient its focus on competing for influence with Al-Qaeda. In December of 2014, former DIA Director Mike Flynn and I were asked to meet with then newly appointed Special Presidential Envoy to the Coalition to Counter ISIL, General John Allen, at his office at the State Department. We were there to talk about a program concept that we had put together that would have focused on tracking and targeting senior Islamic State figures within Syria. General Allen was more concerned at that point in time about the group's influence capacity online. To give you an idea of just how expansive the group's presence in social media had become, in a March 2015 story in the New York Times that covered some of my work, I noted that they had a massive presence, and Rick Gladstone, who wrote the story, noted that by credible estimates, they had established anywhere between 70 and 90,000 Twitter accounts. Now, if you jump ahead to February 2016, Twitter acknowledged that it had taken down 125,000 of its accounts on its platform, which were predominantly used to promote narratives linked to the Islamic State. Earlier, I mentioned that it is managing a recruitment coup incitement program, and the reason for that is this. While it's demanding for people the world over to pledge allegiance to al-Baghdadi, it's meanwhile the key set of narratives emphasize that allegiance is not affirmed through words alone. Rather, allegiance is affirmed through one of two sets of actions, making hijra, in other words, immigration into the so-called caliphate, or the group's primary areas of operations, to help defend and expand territorial holdings, or waging jihad at home. So what you can see there is that action is essential to the affirmation of support and allegiance, in the manner in which the group is going about tailoring its messages are oriented around inciting violence effectively. So in April 2016, there was a big report in the Wall Street Journal that highlighted some of my work tracking Islamic State propagandist networks on Twitter. You could see some exchanges between my account and some of those propagandists in that report if you look it up online. And what that report effectively highlighted was that while Twitter was claiming that it had suspended all of these accounts, Islamic State members and supporters now tout as credentials the number of times that their accounts have been closed. In one of those cases, it was more than 500 accounts for one of the key propagandists. So they're by no means deterred with this suspension campaign. And a couple months later, of course, Twitter has now more recently claimed that it has taken down 235,000 accounts, which are primarily used to promote narratives linked to the Islamic State as well as al-Qaeda. The irony there is that the day that it put out that report, Muhammad al-Makdisi, who is regarded as the most influential cleric in the global jihad movement, as a Salafi jihadist cleric with links to senior al-Qaeda figures, he's based in Jordan. The day that they made that announcement, his following on Twitter was just under 50,000 accounts, and that following was greater than the following for the official Twitter account used by Brett McGurk, who is General Allen's successor as the special presidential envoy to the coalition to counter ISIL. Now, of course, al-Makdisi has rejected this claim of a caliphate that's been declared by the Islamic State, but his presence on Twitter certainly provides incentive for the Islamic State to continue using Twitter to compete for influence with the group. And you can also see on Twitter that his close associate, a cleric known as Abu Qatada, who's also a very well-known associate of senior al-Qaeda figures, has an even larger following on Twitter. So there's a big problem in terms of Twitter's analysis of what this platform is being used for by these clerics. Now, the same day that it declared it had suspended 235,000 accounts, one thing that stood out as a problem was that Anjem Choudhury, whom I'm sure you all have heard of from various news reports, a fairly high-profile cleric based in the UK and a very outspoken Islamic State supporter, his account with more than 30,000 followers was still active on Twitter. And it was active until shortly after he was finally convicted of providing support to the Islamic State by calling on people to do whatever they could to support it. In other words, waging jihad at home or going to the so-called caliphate to help and defend and expand territorial holdings. So that's a big problem itself, because while he was not using the account actively, Twitter is something that, as I'm sure most of you all are aware of, can be used for more than just marketing purposes. In other words, more than just pushing out these radical or violent extremists, however you want to phrase that, narratives. It's also something that a group like the Islamic State can use for market research purposes. So when you leave open an account like that, people who continue to follow it, perhaps retweet old tweets that are there on or like old tweets, all of that's information that an Islamic State recruiter or somebody who's involved with their external operations program can use to identify possible fence sitters, as the National Counterterrorism Center's officials put it to me in February of this year when they asked me if I'd be willing to help map on Twitter networks of potential fence sitters here in the United States. Now, of course, I was thinking, gosh, aren't you guys already doing that? I mean, in December 2014, the special presidential envoy to the coalition to counter ISIL is telling me that he's more concerned about blunting the group's influence capacity online versus actually targeting senior leaders, because the assessment at that point was that the group would implode within 6 to 8 months, and the big problem in the West would be dealing with retribution attacks for effectuating that outcome. So February 2016, this year, you've got a senior official at the National Counterterrorism Center who's tasked with managing online countering violent extremism programs, asking me if I can help to map those networks of people who might be willing to pull triggers for the Islamic State. It's really extraordinary. It's a sad situation where policy has failed to provide a means for officials to proactively counter the group's activities on social media. And what you can see from the attacks that continue to occur since mid-2014 here in the West, attacks executed by people who've never been trained by the Islamic State within its primary areas of operation, is that this framework for incitement, this set of narratives, this claim that they have restored a figure who holds superior rank over all Muslims, and if you're receptive to that, you're going to be receptive to his demands that you do one of those two things I mentioned earlier to affirm your allegiance to him. So that continues to persist on social media. More recently, a lot of my work focuses on the next cyber sanctuary, which is Telegram Messenger. Since Telegram started developing a channels feature, which has become very attractive for Islamic State members, that's been where a lot of the content is transitioning. Twitter has increased some sort of algorithmic formatting on layering things on the fire hose of all the data that Twitter users create to more rapidly identify clusters of Islamic State network accounts. and suspending those accounts very quickly. It's sort of a shotgun approach, but again, that's not really a deterrence that's very meaningful. I think one of the things that stands out most for me about the comfort that key Islamic State figures still have on Twitter was earlier this year, Sally Jones, the widow of deceased British hacker and Islamic State member Junaid Hussain, who was killed in a drone strike last year, took to Twitter to both harass my friend Rukmini Kalamaki, who covers the Islamic State at the New York Times, to harass her while also harassing me on Twitter, retweeting a tweet, for instance, where I had noted that her absence from Twitter suggested that perhaps she was up to something nefarious. Could it be that she was training female jihadis to deploy into the West? And she seemed to like that, and it got a lot of attention in the British press. So these accounts are being used, as I mentioned, for the recruitment, cum incitement program. There's also a more direct aspect of it where they're using these accounts to literally go out and harass or threaten journalists as well as terrorism researchers and analysts who focus on what the group is doing online. The day before Omar Mateen struck in Orlando, for instance, a official Telegram messenger channel for the Islamic State's network on that platform reposted a post from a semi-official channel that we were all kind of curious about whether or not the managers had any linkage with the official accounts, in which they were calling for a online harassment and threat campaign against me. So I got spammed with a bunch of videos where my face was imposed over, unfortunately, victims of beheadings. So the ways that you can go about using these technologies are very, very dynamic. The comfort that still exists for these groups to continue using these technologies is a big problem, and that's something that we'll talk about in the Q&A section. But essentially, there are policies that a company like Twitter or Facebook could impose on their platforms for access to them that would create that deterrent effect. For instance, if you want to use a virtual private network or VPN to mask your physical location when you're online, which is something that Islamic State members have been encouraging their supporters to do for over a year. That was something that Junaid Hussain, whom I mentioned earlier, was very vocal about, the need to achieve communication security and operational security online. If you want to use a VPN and go on Wikipedia, for instance, right now, and try to alter content and issue terroristic threats, you're not going to be able to do that because they've pretty much tracked all the various IPs associated with VPNs and blocked access for editorial purposes. That's something that a technology innovator like Twitter or Facebook could do to make it less attractive for terrorists and other illicit actors to be exploiting their technologies for purposes that can even threaten U.S. national security and the national security interests of our friends. And before I pass this to Nitsana, whom I'm sure you're all waiting to hear much more interesting things from, this isn't just obviously an issue for the United States or Israel. I was asked after an introduction by General David Petraeus to an ambassador from the Mideast from an Arab ally country. I was asked about a week later to go over there and meet with the head of their counterterrorism budget to discuss what was going on in terms of his concerns about the Islamic State's influence within his country. And here he is highlighting for me, expressing grave misgivings that it is American companies' social media platforms which have become the crucial tools utilized by the Islamic State to reach into his backyard and try to recruit people and try to incite violence. So with that, I'll leave it to Nitsana. I look forward to answering any questions you have.
Thank you, Michael. Our next panelist is Nitsana Darshan-Leitner, who will discuss the Facebook, Twitter lawsuits that Shurat Hadin, the place I interned for, has filed under the ATA. Nitsana is the founder and president of Shurat Hadin, the Israel Law Center. She has led and won a number of major legal cases against terror organizations, resulting in more than $2 billion worth of judgments and collecting $200 million in compensation for victims of terror. Ms. Darshan-Leitner is regularly quoted in the international media as an authority on terror financing. So thank you, Nitsana.
Well, thank you, Aviv, for organizing this important conference on this important issue, and thank you for all for coming. Shurat Hadin is a civil rights organization based in Israel that has been fighting for the past 15 years terrorism in court. We bring terror organizations like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, PLO, Hezbollah to court. Yes, it's possible. We sue countries that support terrorism like Iran, Syria, North Korea, and we file lawsuits and legal actions against those who are aiding and abetting terrorism, like banks that provide financial services to terror organizations. For example, Arab Bank, National Westminster Credit Lyonnais, UBS, American Express Bank, LCB, Bank of China, and recently have been bringing the social media to court for incitement and also for aiding and abetting terrorism. If you know about what's going on in Israel in the past 10 months since October 2015, you will see that a lot of teenagers are taking knives and stabbing Jews in the streets. 15 years old, 16 years old, sometimes 13 years old, teenagers that just go and stab innocent civilians. And one would wonder where this hatred, where this idea is coming from. How these teenagers are going to their mother's kitchen, grab a knife, and have the state of mind to go and kill Jews. And very quickly you realize that it all derives from incitement to kill Jews. But this incitement that used to be in the town squares, in the mosques, in leaflets that were printed out and given to the mass in previous intifadas, today is taking place in the social media. You will find thousands of posts calling to kill Jews. We just saw encouraging speeches that calling to kill Israelis, pages that call stab the Jews. You'll find videos illustrating how to stab, how to sharpen the knife, or even better, where to stab, how to twist the knife, what type of poison to put on the knife before you go and stab, where to ambush the Jew, how to distinguish him among others. And when the terrorists go and stab, they're all teenagers, they all share Facebook, they all have Facebook page, they go and post on their pages, we are going to become Shahid. It's time to open a third intifada. It's time to liberate Al-Aqsa Mosque. Death is a right and we deserve this right. And after they go and post and after they go and stab, you will find thousands or tens of thousands of posts encouraging their act, endorsing it, glorifying it, telling others to follow them, making them martyrs. All this is going on in Facebook because Facebook is the most popular network among the Palestinians. Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of the Israeli government, approached Facebook and asked them to turn down the incitement. Officials from the Justice Ministry in Israel, Foreign Ministry, Internal Ministry went and met with officials of Facebook, explained the idea, the problem, and asked them to shut down this incitement, to delete posts, to close pages. They show them what this incitement is causing on the street of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. But Facebook said that they are only a bulletin board. They are not getting involved in the content that goes on their pages. They are not siding by any of the parties. They are not intervening with this conflict. They have their rules and they follow their community standards. So we, in Shurat Hadin, decided to sue Facebook. We gathered 20,000 Israelis and filed an injunction against Facebook in the state court in New York. The lawsuit has two folds. One is really to get an injunction against Facebook. Anytime there is an incitement to kill Jews, that simply turn it down, take it off. But we also asked that Facebook would be proactive. We wanted Facebook to monitor the incitement itself and to take it down. Facebook filed a response. They came and say that they are immune by the Communications Decency Act. This is a law legislated in 1996 when Congress wanted to leave the internet open. They granted blanket immunity to servers and social media networks for anything that goes on in their pages, for the content on their platform. We file our response as well, and we argue that first, when Congress legislated this law, this Communication Decency Act, they did not envision this type of incitement that really will cause people to go and kill. Such type of speech that causes an imminent and clear danger is not protected by freedom of speech, is not protected by the First Amendment. This is not what Congress wanted to preserve, to save when they legislated this law. Also, we claim that Facebook is not like a simple bulletin board, that they are very involved with their users, they push ads, they connect between people, between the users in the community. We also claim that they have the algorithm, the tools to take this incitement, to monitor it, and to take it down, right? The same way they know what type of coffee I drink in the morning, or what gym I go to, and they can push me ads accordingly. They can monitor these deadly words and take them down. And lastly, we claim that Facebook does get involved, but it bent to what side? You have the video? And in order to prove that, we created two pages, two identical pages. One that called to kill Israelis, hold on 1 second. And one that called to kill Palestinians. And we posted identical posts on both pages with identical images, just with one difference. One's against Palestinians, one's against Israelis. And after 2 days, we asked Facebook to take both pages down. Facebook immediately took down the page that called to kill Palestinians and sent us a fair message saying that they checked the page and it does not fit their community standards. But they left the Israeli page standing. They sent us a message saying that they checked the page and it does not violate their community standards. Let's watch. Months passed and we saw no movement from Facebook. So we were thinking, brainstorming, what else can we do? And quickly realized that there is one thing that everybody is afraid of and everybody cares about, which is money. And we realized that there is one thing that Facebook is not really immune of. It's aiding and abetting terrorism. If you open a page for a designated terror organization, if you provide social media services to a designated terrorist on the watch list of the State Department, You are violating the Anti-Terrorism Act. The Anti-Terrorism Act, law from 1996, prohibits any American citizen or American company to provide material support to a designated terror organization. Facebook, by allowing Hamas or other terror organizations to use their platforms, is violating the Anti-Terrorism Act. This law has criminal liability and civil liability. Terror victims can file lawsuits against these American companies that aiding and abetting terrorism. So we gathered 5 American families. Micah is one of them, that lost their loved ones in the last heinous terror attacks in Israel and filed a $1 billion lawsuit against Facebook in the Federal District Court of New York. More to come in questions and answers.
Thank you, Nitsana. Now we'll move on to our final panelist, Mr. Micah Avni, the CEO of Peninsula Group Limited and a publicly traded Israeli commercial finance institution. He was ranked as the 25th most influential person in Israel by The Marker magazine in 2015. After Mr. Avni's father, Richard Lakin, was brutally murdered by Palestinian terrorists in October 2015, Micah founded Stop Incitement, an organization whose goal is to rid incitement to hatred, violence, and terror from social media. Micah.
Thank you. I want to thank Aviv and Shlomo for organizing this event and for inviting me, and all of you for coming and spending your time here. Appreciate that. I'm going to share with you a tragic personal journey that I've been through over the past year, and talk a little bit about what I've learned. My father, Richard Lakin, grew up not far from here. He was a kind, gentle man, an educator, a teacher, an elementary school principal, a teacher of teachers. He kind of summarized his life's work in a book called Teaching is an Act of Love, where he described every child as a miracle that needs to be nurtured with love. He influenced thousands of people. He was also a civil rights activist. He led student groups here in Boston in the 60s. He marched with Dr. Martin Luther King. He brought students down south to join sit-ins in restaurants and on buses. When he became an elementary school principal, he integrated the all-white suburban school that he ran in Connecticut and set up the first integrated summer camp, Camp King, where black and white children played together over the summers. When our family moved to Israel, my parents set up a school teaching English as a second language, and the first and most important thing that he had to say about that was that he wanted Muslim and Christian and Jewish children to study together. And for 20 years they ran a school like that in Jerusalem with Muslim and Christian and Jewish children studying together. He was also very active in coexistence movements in Israel. And most of all, he was a grandfather of 8, which he was very proud of. Almost a year ago, I was in a business meeting in Tel Aviv, probably the most important business meeting in my life. I had just returned from Paris, and I brought champagne to pour at a big closing that we were going to have. And I received a telephone call from my mother, and she never calls in the middle of the day, so I answered. She said, "There's been this terrible terror attack in Jerusalem, and I've been calling your father for 10 minutes, and he's not answering." I immediately knew that something was wrong. I had that feeling that I'd never experienced before in my life, and I just stood up and walked out of the meeting. And I got in the car and started driving to Jerusalem, which is about an hour away. And in the car, I called all the hospitals over and over again and called his phone over and over again. Nobody knew where he was. Eventually, after about 20 calls, somebody answered his phone. They said, "He's here on the operating table, we're fighting for his life. Come to Hadassah and Karen Hospital," and hung up. I arrived there about a half hour later, and I was met by Neila, an Arab woman who heads the emergency nursing, and she was in tears. She said, "I was at your father's house a week ago. He's been teaching both of my sons for years." She couldn't control herself. She hugged me. 2 men in their early 20s boarded a bus, a public bus in Jerusalem, My father, along with 20 or 30 other people, all people on their way home from doctor's appointments or school or what have you, were sitting on the bus. These two terrorists stood up and they took out a gun and they started shooting people. They shot my father in the head at point blank range. He fell to the ground, and after he fell to the ground, they took out a knife. They stabbed him in the face and the chest. They put the knife into his stomach and pulled it up, just like we saw in that video, severing most of his internal organs. The knife broke in his chest and was left there. He remained unconscious in intensive care for almost 2 weeks before he passed away. When he passed away, Neila was standing there next to me crying, holding my hand. And so I spent 2 weeks in the intensive care unit by his side, and I don't know who here has been in intensive care unit, and I wouldn't wish that upon anybody. But there's nothing to do, right? You're just there and everybody's unconscious and it's quiet and you can't disturb and you have a whole lot of time to think. And there were 3 thoughts that kept going through my head. And the first one was, what makes 2 20-year-olds do something like that? I mean, you should be in college or working or starting a family or traveling the world. What brings somebody to the point where they could shoot an innocent old man in the head at point blank range and then put a knife into him? How can that happen? Why is terror spreading so quickly? I'm going to ask you all to take out your phones for a second, if you could. And I'd like you to take out your phones and type in Wikipedia, list of Islamic terror attacks. I'd like you to take a look at that list, because it's going to prove to you a trajectory which I'll describe, which is that radical Islamic terror around the world is growing over the past 15 years at an almost exponential pace, and it's spreading geographically. It's not at all an Israeli problem or an American problem, it's an international problem. You'll see in that list that there were a few attacks in the 80s that grew in the 90s, and you'll see that list grow both in quantity and in geography until today where attacks are being added almost every day. I landed in New York the other day, I got in a cab, and within an hour I found myself 2 blocks from a bomb that went off in Chelsea, surrounded by police cars. You had this man running with a machete in Minnesota the other day. It's a problem that's spreading at an almost exponential pace. And for those of you who study the human mind a little bit, you'll know that people think in a linear fashion. So we think about how long it took us to walk this last mile, that's how long it will take to walk the next mile. But that's not how exponential trajectories work. Things move much faster. So if you take that trajectory and you look at how it's grown in the past 15 years, and now you think out 5, 10, 15 years in the future, you'll realize that we have a very, very big problem on our hands in the West. And finally, the final question was, how can we stop this? About 2 days after the attack, the Hamas Student Union put out a reenactment video. I can't show it here, I've seen it too many times and it just makes me sick, but basically they set up a fake bus with students dressed as Jews, and they had 2 terrorists, like we saw in that video, get ready and get on the bus, start shooting people and stabbing them. And that video went completely viral. It was passed around on YouTube and on Twitter and on Facebook and got millions of views all around the world. And the message of that video was very clear. Go out and kill Jews. If you do that, you'll go to heaven. It's a good thing to do. Here's how to do it. And that's what we're encouraging. And I started to research what we're talking about here, which is the incitement on social media. And I found the following. First of all, you find everything from imams who are preaching to children to go out and do this kind of thing. What we saw some examples. You find the concept of turning people into martyrs, shahidim, saying if you go out and do this, you'll go to heaven. You find instructional videos of exactly how to use a knife or make a bomb, and these are everywhere and in massive quantities. And I'm just talking about the English language. If you then go and look what goes on in the Arabic language, it's an order of magnitude greater in terms of the quantity. You can't even after about a week of researching this and talking to people, I had a kind of eureka moment, and I realized something very simple and very clear, which we all need to understand. Terror doesn't happen in a vacuum. Somebody doesn't get up in the morning and say, I'm going to go out, and a 13-year-old doesn't say, I'll take a knife and run in the street and stab somebody. It doesn't happen. They have to be motivated to do that. They have to be worked up. They have to be educated to that. And it's not one conversation or two conversations. And what you'll see is that social media has basically facilitated the spread of motivation for terror, which is causing this trajectory to grow. So the root cause of terror is not social media, but that shift from 100 people sitting in a mosque or getting a leaflet and reading it to millions of people seeing this over and over and over again has created such massive motivation that that's what's driving this rapid growth in terror. You know, I don't know how many of you have children, but you can imagine my children, you know, they do spend 2 or 3 hours a day on the internet, on their iPad. And, you know, they're watching videos of Barney, and it teaches them important lessons like sharing and playing together and being nice and polite. But take that same child and show him over and over again inciting videos, telling him to go out and kill, telling him to go out and wreak terror. And it's going to have an effect on their mind. And you'll find inciting videos starting from Mickey Mouse type videos through elementary school appropriate videos, through high school videos, all inciting children to kill. And so what I realized is that if we want to slow down this dramatic growth of terror, what we need to do is slow down the dissemination of the motivation for terror. And the only way to do that, is at the source. There are a couple server bays in California mostly that all of this information run through. And those server bays, they know exactly what's going on. They have algorithms that know every single piece of information. So when people complained about pornography on Facebook years back, they didn't do anything about it until finally Toys R Us called them up and said, we're going to cancel our advertising on Facebook. They had a board meeting a couple days later, and within a week and a half, there was no more pornography on Facebook, and you can try it. There is no pornography. If you go put up a picture, you'll find out that your Facebook account is closed within a few minutes and that the FBI is knocking at your door a few minutes later. So they can do that. You all are familiar with content-based advertising. You've all probably noticed that if you send messages in Gmail or WhatsApp, suddenly you're getting advertisements that are connected in that. So those servers have the ability, and then the companies that control them, to stop this incitement, to stop this motivation, to basically slow the spread of terror, which is beginning to affect all of our lives in a very dramatic way. What they're missing is the will to do that. And you know, you ask how can it be that somebody is responsible for such a large organization and has this ability and doesn't do it? And I guess, you know, the answer is pretty simple, maybe cynical, that they're corporations and they're only looking at the bottom line. So what I decided to do on a personal level is to create a pressure system to cause those companies to self-regulate, to basically get to a point where they say it makes sense for us to take down this motivation, to slow the spread of terror, and to do it not because they think it's the right thing to do, which one would hope they would do, but because there's so much pressure on them that they have to. I began by writing an op-ed in the New York Times, the Facebook Intifada, which was one of the most read op-eds ever, and it was syndicated everywhere. I got feedback from security organizations all around the world, from academics all around the world, and it kicked off a discussion, which now if you look, you'll see that it's being discussed around the world, putting pressure on public opinion. We've worked with Shurat Hadin in filing this lawsuit and encouraging others to file similar lawsuits. And we've initiated legislation in Israel. We've already passed a law on a preliminary reading, which would basically fine social media companies for posting, allowing insightful material to be posted. All of that in a hopes to basically slow the motivation, reduce the motivation for terror, and make the world a safer place.
Thank you, Micah, and thank you to all the panelists for your individual presentations. I think you did a very good job at emphasizing what the problem at hand is. I'd now like to move on to some specific questions I have for each of you. Okay, so my first question is kind of targeted towards Nativ and Michael, but Micah and Nitsana are also welcome to answer. I kind of want to know if there's any evidence of the effectiveness or impact of the terrorist how-to videos and or other terrorist inciting content floating around social media. That is, in your professional capacity, have you been able to find correlations between the quantity or quality of the terrorist content online and the attacks themselves?
Well, I think that one of the most outstanding examples that may come to mind for people in this room who were here at the time is the Boston Marathon attack. The Tsarnaev brothers obviously gathered information about how to construct bombs from an online publication, Inspire, which is produced by Al-Qaeda's branch in Yemen. And the organization continues to push out issues of Inspire calling for attacks in the United States, continues to push out information about how to build other bombs, some of which they claim can make it through airport security. And this is a very big problem because they're not only providing the narratives which imbue a receptive consumer with the notion that there are benefits to be had by executing terrorist attacks in the United States in particular, but also in Europe, but also with know-how of constructing weaponry that would be very difficult to find if you're working in law enforcement, if you're a counterterrorism practitioner. As they highlighted in a issue of Inspire that was specially dedicated to that attack weeks later, the phenomenon of the so-called lone wolf is the greatest threat to the United States, and all of that is bolstered, all of those narratives, with the use of Twitter continually by Al-Qaeda propagandists and their supporters. So if you're receptive to those narratives, you're constantly going to be finding more and more encouragement in spaces like Twitter and occasionally on Facebook, but increasingly on Telegram Messenger channels.
I guess my question is for the skeptics out there, are there numbers of showing kind of more of a direct correlation? Because I'm sure this is pretty important for a lawsuit as well.
I think that something that was pretty extraordinary was Rukmini, whom I mentioned earlier, recently interviewed Harry Sarfo, who was inducted into the Islamic State's External Operations Division, and subsequently decided that he did not want to continue supporting the group, managed to flee Syria, went back to Germany, was arrested, and he's incarcerated there now. I've personally interviewed him. He's very forthcoming with information. He noted that the group is very keenly focused on utilizing social media to radicalize and mobilize would-be terrorists here in the United States because it's so difficult to move people out of the group's primary areas of operation into the U.S. Now, that doesn't answer the question of efficacy, but what I would say is this. As I mentioned, if you look at the rate of attacks, the instance rate since June 2014 when that group declared its caliphate, when you look at that rate of attacks, that increase annually since June 2014 in the West, attacks executed by people who have not undergone training overseas, if you personally are working with government agencies right now, or if you will be, it will be shocking for you to take a look at what's known that I can't get into too many details about here in the way of the online activities of a number of these people. Unfortunately, it's caught in hindsight more than not. That was certainly the case with the Tsarnaev brothers, certainly the case that there was an awareness, for instance, with Nidal Hassan interacting with Anwar al-Awlaki online, clearly pursuant to his receptiveness to the narratives, the calls for attacks in the West that al-Awlaki was pushing out on Facebook and using a YouTube account. The Islamic State has basically taken that program of ease of access to the narratives and ease of access to the actual group members to new heights. So it's really going about this in a much more dynamic and engaging way. And again, I think that the instance rate of attacks, when you look at that, the primary means by which the Islamic State, for instance, is going to be pushing out those calls to a receptive audience is via social media over the past 2 years.
I think I will add from the Israeli perspective that, well, first of all, for what you've asked, the answer is yes, for sure. For those terrorists who are arrested after committing a terror attack, when they were asked why they did that and where they got their ideas from and the how-to from, then most of them say that because they saw it on the internet. So for sure, we know that, and it's a fact that those people got inspired and taught how to do and why to do because of what they saw on the internet, on social media, on Facebook, on YouTube. And I will also say that we see correlation between periods of time where there is lots of incitement, and then we have lots of terror attacks. Just for example, take the last weekend when there was one terror attack when a Palestinian stabbed an Israeli, and immediately after that we saw videos and we saw the volume of incitement content going up on the internet, and then we started to see much more attacks. So what's going on with the incitement on the internet is that it's making one terror attack into a wave of terror attacks, and we completely see that. That's like numbers in Israel.
Maybe I'll just give you an example, Aviv, of how incitement caused someone to call and kill. There was a mother of 6. Her name was Daphna Meir, living in a settlement of Itamar, where a 15-year-old Palestinian opened the door of her kitchen and attacked her and pushed a knife into her stomach. Her kids, the little kids, were standing around her. So she held the knife and just kept it in her stomach that the terrorists will not make another use of the knife. She died. She saved her kids, but she died. And the 15-year-old Palestinian was arrested. And he said in his interrogation that he saw a short movie that drove him, it was against Israelis, against the IDF, shortly before he killed the mother, who drove him to go and kill her. So proves that any sort of incitement, especially a visual, cause really people to go and kill. And we have to remember another thing, that all these so-called lone wolves that go and kill, go and stab, are not experienced terrorists, are not trained terrorists. They don't belong to a terror organization. They are affiliated with a terror organization, but they themselves did not get training from any source or any authority. You learn it from their interrogation. Some of them who remain alive come and simply tell their story, which does not include any indication of previous training, showing that it all comes from things that they learn from places, sources which are excessive to them, which is internet or TV.
Yeah, I'm not a psychiatrist, but one thing that I can say I suspect would be worth looking at if it's not already being fleshed out in open source literature that I'm just not aware of right now, is that when you spend 8 hours a day looking at the Islamic State's activities on Twitter or on Telegram Messenger channels, what you find is that there is this incredible emphasis on violence in ways that is very graphic. You know, you've obviously seen clips of beheading videos and all of that. I mean, the emphasis on it also plays into a behavioral engineering program of some kind, and I'm sure that anybody here who has a background in psychology or psychiatry studies, if there are any psychiatrists in the room, it might be worthwhile for you to speak up, because if you're consuming all of that content and say you live in a place like Minnesota, you're perhaps going to become more and more comfortable with that gruesome act of violence that a lot of times it requires somebody to go into a war zone to really become comfortable with that sort of violence that's being called for in terms of the types of attacks that they're calling for.
Thank you. So, Nitsana, you mentioned that Shurat Hadin is trying to get Facebook to shut down these pages. And beforehand, Captain Nativ had noted that after Facebook had shut down one of the terrorist pages, it had then resurfaced and gotten a lot more likes than it initially had. So my next question, which is open to everyone, is how do you answer the concern that Facebook would have to continually shut down these pages that resurface shortly after they're removed? Can these platforms even effectively shut down these pages and this content? What would the financial burden look like? Would it be a waste of resources? What could we possibly, is it a fair ask from these businesses?
Yeah, Aviv, I'd like to point out that in the case of child pornography, if you put up a pornographic picture of a child, Facebook immediately tags it. It gets a unique computer ID. I'm not a specialist in algorithms. And it can never go up again. It goes into a database, which I believe is shared also with other social media companies. And that picture will never appear again. It doesn't matter where. And it costs very little to do. from their perspective, and it works. So theoretically, the same picture of inciting somebody to run amok in a mall in Minnesota and stab people could be taken down. As for the financial ramifications, they actually work in the other way. Facebook makes an inordinate amount of money from advertising on radical Islamic traffic and jihadist traffic, an inordinate amount of money. Hamas, ISIS, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda are all AdWords in Facebook ads, which they actually charge money for people who do searches for those words. It's big, big dollars that they will lose out on if they start monitoring this.
Yeah, the problem with some of the content analysis is that it's focused on the demonstration of certain activities, be it child pornography that the algorithms are designed to identify very quickly, or violent acts. It's not oriented or tailored to identify something like Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, his, I think, third to last missive, and I have screenshots that I can show you where it stayed up on YouTube for, I think, about a week and had 16,000 views before it was taken down. So he's just sitting there, an old guy rambling on, pointing his fingers like this, and so it's not designed to pick up on that. And also with something like the Islamic State, you know, tailoring programs to identify videos and knock them down, which YouTube does, for the most part, do a pretty good job of, that doesn't create, you know, for Twitter a good playbook, because more than not, all they're doing is putting links on Twitter to where you can view the content or download a publication on another site. So really, in my mind, what needs to become the focus is on deterrence. And again, if you were to impose policies such as you can only use a VPN to access Twitter, which the National Counterterrorism Center said earlier has become the preferred platform in social media for the Islamic State. If you can only access it when a VPN is active, if you have a verified account, that creates a deterrent effect. I mean, terrorists are very well aware that JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, and other agencies use their activities online to try to track and locate them in the real world. And so you've also seen, as I mentioned, the Islamic State emphasizing the importance of operational security online, not just for members, but supporters whom they hope to recruit or incite to violence. And so I think that really the absence of that really does highlight a deficient strategic analysis on the parts of these companies about ways illicit actors can utilize their technologies for a range of criminal activities. Data Miner, which is part owned by Twitter, it received a substantial amount of money from CIA's venture capital arm In-Q-Tel to develop algorithms that could be layered on Twitter's Firehose, which it has exclusive access to the full Firehose. Other companies can purchase snippets of it, but to layer algorithms on it to identify everything from extremist content to other types of communications which are of interest to the intelligence community. And Data Miner also sells these services to financial institutions to track trends in consumers' interests, et cetera. Well, Data Miner became effectively an unwitting co-conspirator in a white-collar crime when somebody created a sock puppet account on Twitter to look like a well-respected financial analyst or trader, I forget which, and started pushing out information about a certain company. Data Miner starts reporting that to the firms that it's selling analysis of the Firehose to, and all of a sudden traders start selling off that stock because it's negative information. So I mean, there you go. You have another example of ways that not just, you know, child predators or pornographers or terrorists, but also white-collar criminals can utilize these technologies. So right now you've got an industry that is incredibly closely linked with our society and increasingly linked with our daily interests. And yet the environment in which that set of companies operates, it's self-regulatory. I mean, if you could imagine that with the advent of the car, the automobile, that there was no, you know, laws that came into play to govern how you went about utilizing that new set of technology, all of the problems that might come with that. Well, essentially you have that at Twitter, Facebook, et cetera. They develop their own policies. Input from the public is used to define their assumptions about what constitutes corporate responsibility. As was mentioned earlier, the policies don't necessarily effectively identify narratives that are even supportive of terrorist groups. Like Anjem Chowdhury, who I mentioned earlier, he wasn't defying any of Twitter's policies. He wasn't calling for violence or anything like that. But everything that he was saying if you're a terrorism analyst, was consistent with the narratives of Islamic State leaders. Right now, you've got Yusuf al-Qaradawi's Twitter account has 1.1 million followers. He's the spiritual guide of Hamas, a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization. He's the founding chair of the Union of Good, which is sanctioned by the Treasury Department for raising money for Hamas and terrorist groups. And the reason he hasn't himself been designated a specially designated global terrorist like Sally Jones, whom I mentioned earlier, is because of the economics of diplomacy. He's one of the most influential Sunni clerics in the world. So he gets a pass on that, but because he's also not literally calling for attacks on Twitter, he gets to have a Twitter account with 1.1 million followers. And it's incredible the way that this occurs. And I'm sure that there are some people here who are practicing or have been practicing attorneys who would maybe want to chime in on that, because if you can imagine a industry which is as consequential as social media is becoming in terms of its potential impact on our society that is largely self-regulated, that presents a series of possible problems that I think are worth discussing in a larger context.
Okay, so given that there is this possibility to shut down these pages, the next question would be, does the government have any utility from keeping them up? So would the government or law enforcement or even Facebook itself have an easier time tracking these would-be terrorists through these social media outlets? Or is
well,
that...
again, more than not, the ones who are of real interest to, say, agents at Washington Field Office, whom I've helped with a number of different issues focused on the Islamic State, they're going to concomitantly be utilizing technologies that are going to mask their physical locations. Sometimes you have screw-ups and all of that. Sometimes they even just use a protected account and they link up with other accounts so that you can't see what they're communicating about. One of the infiltrator groups that I used to collaborate with identified an account that was expressing foreknowledge of the Paris attacks. They had infiltrated the network and they were able to gather that information, unfortunately, after the attacks. But, I mean, there are occasional instances where information can get out there that highlights somebody knew about something in advance or knows about something. There have been some rare cases, they're increasingly few, where the so-called chatter points to a likelihood of an attack occurring in a certain place. A planned attack in Tunisia in July 2015 was a key example of that. I was involved with the group that located information, a correspondence chain taking place between Junaid Hussein and a cell that was based in Tunisia. But it's really just one of those things where, back to your question of, is that data useful? Right now, also, in the case of the Islamic State especially, you can almost see that there's a growing body of evidence that suggests they have effectively accelerated the radicalization process by adding to this framework of calls for violence this authoritative figure of a caliph, because the rate of attacks has increased so significantly, and you pair that with their activity on social media, that whereas it used to be the focus was on monitoring, hence the investment, as I mentioned, from NQTel and Data Miner, it really should pivot towards disruption. And I think there's a growing awareness of that. I've been contacted by the top CT officials at the National Security Council a couple months ago who are still asking, we'd like to meet to discuss ways to prevent this use of Twitter for building and support for building and reinforcing, as they put it, support for the Islamic State. And you're just thinking to yourself, really, guys, what are we paying you for? I mean, you've been aware of this issue since years before the Islamic State had even declared a caliphate, and back when it was still part of al-Qaeda, and Anwar al-Awlaki was calling for things that, manifest in the Fort Hood attack. So there's, unfortunately, a reactive posture here. The monitoring aspect of it, again, because of that potential capacity to accelerate the radicalization process, as Micah was mentioning earlier, the attacks themselves can be confidence builders in the minds of certain receptive audiences. So that itself can have the effect of accelerating the will to act in larger populaces around the world. And I think that the pivot needs to be, again, to disruption instead of just monitoring all of this.
I actually think that there is no way to control the social network by legislation. I think that you can't really legislate a law that tells you what words are allowed to be said or what pictures are allowed to be put or what posts are allowed to be posted by law. You can only restrain the content on the social network facilities by the networks themselves. They should be responsible for the content. They can monitor it, they can decide what is incitement, what is causing death, what is causing violence, which is too much to bear. And they will pick up the words according to the content. You cannot come and say shahid is a bad word and you cannot put it anymore, or murder you cannot use anymore, or knives. By the way, we have booklets that we are giving out about Shurat Hadin for you to learn about the cases. But the bottom line is that we realize that because you cannot control it outside of the company, you need to compel the company to realize that it will be too costly for them not to monitor the incitement. It will be too painful for them to leave it on. And this is why we choose to file a monetary lawsuit against them, because it worked with the banks. When we file lawsuit against the banks that provided financial services to terror organizations, because they thought that they do not have to do due diligence and they don't care who they open bank accounts to, and they are not compelled or have to take steps according to the Anti-Terrorism Act, it cost them a lot of money. They wound up paying hundreds of millions of dollars to terror victims. I believe it will be the same way with the social network media. Facebook, Twitter, we quickly realized that if they keep having incitement on their pages, and if they keep providing material support to designated terror organization, in the end, it will cost them hundreds of millions of dollars. And yes, it costs money. Yes, they have to monitor it. Yes, they have to put manpower. Yes, they did it in Germany when they wanted to take down incitement against incitement to violence against Muslim immigration. They put out 200 people, task force, to monitor the incitement. They can do it. It costs money, but it will cost them more if they don't do it.
Okay, thank you. Nitsana, I actually want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, so I'm just going to ask one last question, and it's going to be addressing the elephant in the room a little bit, meaning we're at a law school right now, and I think what might be going through a lot of people's heads is, what about free speech? And I think it might be an argument that Facebook might want to hide behind as well. So how do you respond to the fact that you can't really, or where do you draw the line between incitement, inciting content, and free speech?
I think, I'm not a legal professional, but I think that it's a established constitutional principle here in the United States that incitement to imminent violence is not allowed, that you can't run into a movie theater and scream fire if there's no fire and thereby endanger the people. So the challenge is divining the gray area, what is and what is not incitement, but the principle that incitement to violence is, incitement to imminent violence is not okay is already established. Now, it may be appropriate from a legislative perspective maybe to move that line a bit, but that is the principle.
I would just say that in my mind, the perfect legislation to address this would focus less on the question of free speech, but again, the attractiveness of these technologies to terrorists and other criminal elements. They're, in law enforcement, increasingly in recent decades, you've seen an emphasis on what you can do to deter crime by increasing the risk associated with it, and that can be everything from installing more, street cameras in places where you tend to see a lot of violent crime, or even burglaries occurring, to, in the case of social media, again, imposing policies that would prevent somebody from hopping on Twitter and literally, as you're saying, screaming, fire from the second row, but being a ghost in terms of officials' ability to locate them, because they've meanwhile used a VPN or some other technology, a Tor browser or something like that, to mask their physical location and make it virtually impossible for law enforcement to find them if they go on and even try to incite violence in the first place.
Well, no question, will be the key question in the legal cases, where you draw the line. It will be the defense number one of the social media networks. We are protected by freedom of speech, and we are going to create a moot court that will deal with this question to see who eventually will win, the terror victims or the social media.
I think if I may, just another word on free speech. I think we have to keep two things in mind. First of all, we're at war. If you look at that trajectory of the growth of terror, when you fight a battle in a war, sometimes people get killed, right? That's part of it. And you don't fight a battle because you want to, but you find yourself in a situation where you have no choice. We have to deal on an international level with this growth of terror. We have to deal with it. And there may be some collateral damage in a little bit of curtailing rights here and there, and that may just be something we have to do. I've noticed watching the kind of American constitutional thought from the outside now, and I've seen that there's this implied slippery slope that most people here seem to think that if you would just curtail a right just a little bit, 2 days later Mussolini will be running the country and you'll have a complete fascist dictatorship. But the truth is, when that concept came out and when they first spoke about it here in America and other countries, if you stood up on a soapbox and said something against the king, you had your head chopped off. We now live in a world where a 10-year-old can set up a YouTube channel and have 10 million followers, right? Where jihadists can tweet to anybody he wants. There's no issue of being able to speak freely. You can do it. The real question, I think, and the real challenge for all of you over the coming years in the legal world is, when is it right to curtail that? When is the danger from the growth of terror so large that you need to curtail it a little bit?
Okay. Thank you to all of you for answering those questions. I now want to move on to Q&A. Quick thing on my behalf, I forgot to mention two of our sponsors, Camera on Campus and Israel on Campus Coalition. My bad, they also helped sponsor this event. And now I'd like to open it up to the audience. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll get a mic around to you, or not.